The big international story, which is the announcement of the killing of Abu Bakr Al Baghdadi, the chief of ISIS, who was killed in a dramatic US raid that took place on Saturday evening. Now, Donald Trump confirmed that Baghdadi had been killed by US Special Forces. Here's Donald Trump talking about that particular raid. Now, let's tell you a little bit about who al-Baghdadi actually was. Now, he was one of the most dreaded terrorists anywhere in the world, rising to notoriety. But that's not where it all started. Now, he was first captured in 2004 as he was part of the then Al-Qaeda fighting the US in the global war against terror. Of course, Baghdadi then fought with Al-Qaeda at that time. He was an integral part of that organization on the ground before he went on to form ISIS on his own. That organization was founded much later once he began to get a foothold in Iraq on his own. Now, the ISIS, in fact, was formed in 2013, becoming a far more radical, can you believe that? A far more radical version of the Al-Qaeda that was currently operating in that region. And the ISIS managed to, in fact, spread its tentacles far and wide. He called for a global caliphate at that famous speech that he had given at a mosque in Mosul in Iraq. Mosul eventually became one of the largest cities under ISIS control in Iraq. Now, that led, of course, to the capture of parts of Iraq and Syria under ISIS control. So, northern part of Syria and parts of Iraq had to, did come under the ISIS's, domain. They were ruling that territory largely with untrained militia who were finding their own position very, very strong against the US forces and other allied forces, both in Iraq as well as Syrian forces in Syria. Let's now talk about how the raid actually went down, because that is what has happened on Saturday night. This is what intelligence sources now say. They say that 8 choppers that were carrying the US Special Operations Forces were involved in this raid. Now, Special Operations Forces are the most elite forces of the US military who were involved in this. The same forces that were involved in fact, the killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad in Pakistan a few years ago. Now, choppers flew for about an hour and 10 minutes. They were circling around this particular area before they could launch the assault. From what we understand, little later after that, in fact, we saw the terrorists of ISIS fighters who were on the ground with Baghdadi, in fact, fired at these American choppers, and then they returned fire on the ground there on those ISIS fighters at this compound where al-Baghdadi was actually currently residing. This is the Idlib province of northwestern Syria. Now, in fact, as 2 of Baghdadi's wife, in fact, were wearing suicide vests at the time the US forces actually reached there, and before they could blow themselves up, the US forces managed to kill both those women who were wearing suicide vests. That aside, 11 children were also found at the complex. Donald Trump and the US administration says no shots were fired at them. They were taken into the custody of the US Special Forces on the ground. Now, what happened to Baghdadi? Because Baghdadi was still there and 3 of his children were still with him. From what we understand, sniffer dogs were also being used by the US forces on the ground there, and they managed to pin Baghdadi into a tunnel at that particular complex. Now, it's not uncommon for people like Baghdadi to create these tunnels or sort of bomb shelters, so to speak, because they know they're constantly on the radar, as Baghdadi has been for the last 5 years. He's been on the radar of the US and other allied forces across that region. Then what happened? He blew himself up because he found himself, caught in a corner, and he killed himself and 3 of his children, unfortunately, in that suicide blast. In fact, he was wearing a suicide vest as well, just as 2 of his wives were. And that is how the raid went down. Now, there was such damage post that suicide blast that the US forces had to rely purely on DNA evidence to try and ascertain whether it was indeed Baghdadi who had been killed, because if you read Donald Trump's tweet from Saturday night, one thing it tells you is that they were waiting to confirm. He put out a cryptic tweet saying that something big has just happened, but he was waiting for US forces to confirm that confirmed DNA that this was indeed Abu Bakr Al Baghdadi, the dreaded terrorist, the founder of ISIS, the leader of the organization, the man responsible for terrorizing so many people across the world, responsible for thousands of deaths across Iraq and Syria, who had been killed in that raid.